Hi there. Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Hi there. Welcome to my live. We're going to talk about Elizabeth Holmes. Big news, big news. Looks like she's headed to prison. She lost her appeal with the Court of Appeal. Her request to delay her prison, she wanted to stay out of prison while the Court of Appeal is considering her other appeal, which is the appeal of her sentence and convictions. So hi there, I'm Michele Hagan, just in case you popped onto this channel. I'm Michele Hagan. I'm a legal analyst and an attorney. You may recognize me because I provided a lot of coverage on the Elizabeth Holmes case, Sonny Balwani, Gabby Petito, Brian, etc. The Idaho murder cases. And by the way, I think I'll do a video on that. Very interesting motion that they filed recently. So anyway, back to Elizabeth Holmes. Okay, so if you want to submit your questions, and I apologize to those of you who have submitted questions on my channel last couple of minutes, I haven't been able to get to it. So I'm just doing this, jumping in live. Didn't even have time to put any earrings on, so we're just going with it. So, okay, I see your questions. So do subscribe if you want to put a question in the chat. Please do subscribe to support my work. And thank you to all of those of you analyzers who have subscribed to my channel, our channel, Michele's Analysis. And by the way, I put a poll on our community page so you can vote. Do you think the trial judge will grant Elizabeth Holmes' request for a May 30th prison surrender date? Very interesting. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about why the Court of Appeals denied Elizabeth Holmes' request to delay prison to be able to stay free while the court was also considering her appeal of her convictions and sentence. I'm also going to talk about whether the judge will grant the May 30th. And I do see your questions. Please do continue to submit your questions. And what this decision, will it have any impact on her pending appeal to have the Court of Appeals throw out the jury's verdict where Elizabeth Holmes was convicted of 4 counts. She was acquitted on the patient counts. She was convicted of defrauding 3 individual investors and 1 conspiracy count, conspiring with Sonny Balwani to defraud investors, which, by the way, triggers that restitution amount, which she was just ordered by the trial court to pay restitution in the amount of $452 million. Jointly with Balwani, and I'll talk about that. They don't split it, so I don't know who's saying that. They don't split it. They're jointly liable. I'll talk about that too, and we're going to talk about the restitution order, and I'm going to point a few things out in this restitution order that I think is very interesting and maybe problematic on appeal. Okay, so let me look at your questions. The $400 million restitution, nope. Pictor, they don't split it. They're both liable for the entire amount of $452 million. What is the total amount? For those of you, and by the way, get your pen and pencils ready because I got a lot of numbers to throw at you. Don't worry, I'm doing simple math because that's all I can handle. So the restitution amount is $452 million. 452, I can't even say this, $452,047,268 million. Just over $452 million. Okay, let me see what other questions. Being a friend, okay, I read somewhere that she had lawyers. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I saw that reporting too. Was their appeal struck? That's why I'm here. Was their appeal struck down right then? No. That's a good question, Fungi. This decision does not necessarily mean that Elizabeth Holmes is going to lose her appeal of her convictions, to have her convictions reversed, tossed out, and to have her sentence tossed out, or for her to be resentenced. Those are 2 separate appeals, 2 different standards. Okay, so why did the Court of Appeal deny her request to delay her prison to stay free while the court was also considering her appeal on her convictions and her sentence? The reason is, I'm just going to just highlight it here. The reason is the Court of Appeal denied it is because Holmes did not raise a substantial question of law or fact. Okay, didn't raise it. She didn't meet the burden. She didn't meet the threshold for the Court of Appeal to overturn the trial court's denial of her request to basically stay at home while the appeal was pending. So now we have two courts, the trial court and the higher court, the Court of Appeal, both denied her request. And by the way, it's not uncommon, or I should say it is common, for defendants to ask for, to make this appeal, right? To have the Court of Appeal to review the lower court's denial. And it's not uncommon, like Balwani did, and I'm sure Holmes will. She actually has requested additional time, right? So she's requesting the May 30th date, May 30th surrender date. So if I did my math right, that's approximately, Balwani got, I think, around 10 to 14 days to get his affairs in order before he surrendered. So it looks like the court, my guess, my analysis is that the court will probably grant the May 30th surrender date to prison, not an immediate surrender. In other words, the court could impose, and by the way, cast your vote in our poll. Do you think the court's going to grant that? The trial court could order her to immediately surrender. But Holmes is saying, Judge, can I have until May 30th to surrender? Where is she going to surrender? Well, that's up to the Bureau of Prisons to determine which location. The trial court has recommended Bryan, Texas, which I think is where Elizabeth Holmes grew up, in Texas. But again, it's up to the Bureau of Prisons to decide which location. Now, if you think about the Balwani, Sonny Balwani, the co-conspirator, the co-defendant of Elizabeth Holmes, although he was tried separately and convicted of all 12 counts, he initially was sent to prison and the judge recommended prison in the East Coast, but the Bureau of Prisons put him in California at the Terminal Island prison in San Pedro, California, near LA. Why? Because one of the reasons why I think Balwani requested that it would be easier for him to work on his appeal. So my question is, do you think Elizabeth Holmes is going to be going to Texas? Or maybe, I think there's Dublin, California is also. I don't know. She may be going to Texas. We'll have to see where the Bureau of Prisons sends her. Okay, let me see. In the chat, thank you everyone for joining me. Please do hit that like button. Please do subscribe. And if you want to contribute to me making these videos and upgrading all of this lighting, I'll put a PayPal link in the description box below the video. And thank you very much to all of those of you who have contributed. Thanks again to all of those of you who have supported. Okay. Hi, Hugo. Okay, let's see. The court already granted May. Oh, they did grant it. Thank you, Matt. She did get it granted. Okay, so she's headed on May 30th to prison. So Elizabeth Holmes will be in prison while the Court of Appeal is reading through the trial transcript, the briefs submitted. And by the way, Elizabeth Holmes submitted her opening brief asking the court to reverse her convictions and in the alternative to be resentenced. In other words, to have a recalculation of the sentence, which she has been sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in prison. Okay. So the other thing is the prosecution should be filing their response to that appeal of her convictions. I think that's due this week or next week. And then Elizabeth Holmes has an opportunity to file a reply brief. And then the next thing that happens is the Court of Appeal, the panel of 3 judges, it could be more if the request is made, but the panel of 3 judges may ask for oral arguments for her appeal of her convictions and sentence. If the court grants oral arguments, both sides appear and argue their points or answer the questions that the justices have, okay? That's up to the Court of Appeal to decide whether they're going to grant oral arguments. They probably will, by the way. And then it'll be questions or arguments that each side wants to make. Okay. And it's very limited. They don't get to talk for a long time. Usually it's time limited, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, maybe even less. Then after the oral arguments, the Court of Appeal will give a written decision on whether they're going to affirm the jury's verdict, those 4 counts of wire fraud, the 1 conspiracy, the 3 individual counts defrauding individual investors, and whether the court, or will the court reverse the jury's verdict, toss out the convictions, and grant Elizabeth Holmes a new trial? Or will the Court of Appeal affirm the sentencing calculation, which is based on the loss amounts? And by the way, I'll get to the restitution because that's, calculation of loss amounts. That's what got her down that scale, right? The more that you defraud people, the more the amount of money that you defraud, the longer you are looking at in prison, according to the federal sentencing guidelines. You can go ahead and take a look at the video I did on calculating her sentence. You can look at, I've done a bunch on the 11-year, 3-month sentence. So I encourage you to look at that. And by the way, if you're curious about why she's appealing, you can look at the video I did on why Elizabeth Holmes is appealing, and also look at the video I did, if you're interested, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, which is the largest group of criminal defense lawyers. That includes both public, private, criminal defense lawyers, judges, professors, etc. They are supporting. They have filed what's called an amicus curiae brief, which is a friend of the court brief, which means they're not parties, but the Court of Appeal will allow other people, other groups to submit briefs on behalf of either side or not taking any position. And the reason they allow amicus briefs is because in those amicus briefs, they provide additional information to the Court of Appeal. For instance, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, in their amicus brief, and you can look at the video I did on that, why they're supporting Elizabeth Holmes' convictions being reversed, is they provided studies on how important it is regarding expert witness testimony. And why that matters is because in the studies that they presented and some of the arguments they made, the juries tend to or are more influenced by expert witnesses than any other witness. Therefore, Elizabeth Holmes was denied her right to a fair trial, the constitutional right, due process, because if, and who's the expert witness here they're claiming, and Elizabeth Holmes is claiming? They're claiming that Dr. Doss, when he gave his testimony, he testified as an improper expert witness. And you can look at the video I did on explaining the difference between lay witnesses and expert witness and why that matters. Because if Dr. Doss is an expert witness and he said when he testified that the technology was not suitable, I'm paraphrasing, not suitable for patient use, that was his expert opinion based on, he did what's called patient test assessment. He looked at the patient results, the test results in 2014 and 2015. When he came on board in 2016, he looked back at those patient test assessments. None of that data was given to Elizabeth Holmes, and they're claiming that is a violation of her due process, because she's not able to, and also confrontation clause, which is your ability to confront witnesses against you. She was not able to ask Dr. Doss what was his opinion based on. This is assuming he's considered an expert witness. So if he's an expert witness, the prosecution has to give a summary of his expert, what his testimony is going to be. And the defense claims they only got a 4-sentence email. They're also supposed to give the basis on what that opinion, or what the opinion is based on, i.e. the data, these patient test results, etc. None of that was given to the defense. And the defense is arguing in their appeal of her convictions and sentence that was a violation of her constitutional rights. Okay, so we'll talk about that as we get down the road. All right, let me look at the other question. I believe she's going to prison when I see it. TL says, yeah, she's going to prison. Jointly liable, Pictor. How does that work? That means they're both on the hook for the $452 million restitution. She was convicted of conspiracy. Conspiracy is two or more people who agree to do a crime, right? In this case, Sunny Balwani, Elizabeth Holmes, in the Elizabeth Holmes trial, were both convicted. I mean, she was convicted of conspiring. It's count one. She was convicted of conspiring with Balwani, her co-conspirator, to defraud investors. All right. She wasn't convicted on conspiring with Balwani to defraud patients. She wasn't convicted on the patient counts. The jury was hung on the 3 individual investor counts, which is very interesting when we look at the restitution. I'll get to that in a second. Hi there, JH. Hello. Thank you for joining. Fungi. So this is official. She's going to surrender on May 30th. No more appeals to stay that surrender date. I don't know. Is she going to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court? I don't know if she even can. We'll have to see. Oral arguments favor the defendant. Not always. And by the way, appeals are very difficult to win. Very difficult to win. And most defendants, just like Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, he's also appealing his convictions and sentence. Most defendants do. In the United States of America, defendants have a constitutional right to appeal any rulings, any orders, any sentence, any conviction, any verdict, etc., to the Court of Appeal. If they lose at the Court of Appeal, defendants may file an appeal with the highest court in the United States Supreme Court. We'll see if that happens. Will I cover the prosecution's response to the appeal? I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. JH, curious. If she gets a new trial, would it be possible to... JH, good question. Curious. If she gets a new trial, would it be possible to get her even more time or restitution than she initially had? Hey, if she gets a new trial, it's a whole new case. Whole new case. She can be tried on additional counts. They could, it's a superseding indictment. The indictment that Elizabeth Holmes was tried on in this trial was the 3rd superseding indictment. That means the 3rd version. That means there had been some changes to the prior indictments. She was charged on the 3rd superseding indictment. Okay, and it's also a question out there. I'm not sure if the judge dismissed those patient counts on the current indictment. If the judge dismissed those patient counts on the current indictment, she cannot be retried because why? Double jeopardy. She cannot be retried on those 3 counts that the jury tried her on and found her not guilty. That doesn't mean that if this goes to new trial, and again, it may be a long shot, although I do think she has some traction. Do go look at the videos I've done. I think she has some traction somewhere on appeal, on some issues on appeal. So if it goes to new trial, if the court sends it back, tosses out the jury's verdict, tosses out the conviction, the sentence, sends it back, the prosecution can retry her. Maybe there'll be additional other patient counts. Maybe there'll be other investor counts. We don't know. Okay. It's a whole new ball game if it's a new trial. Is she any possible legal option to stay? Yeah, well, I don't know, Dano. I don't know. Thanks for joining me. I don't know if she's going to be appealing the Court of Appeal. We'll have to see. Sorry that she's okay. Matt, do you think she's actually paying her legal fees given the huge amount? I don't know. And by the way, our agreements, our financial agreements with our clients, I am a lawyer, okay, and have been for a long time. Was a prosecutor, done defense work, I've done civil, I've done criminal, I've done a ton of different cases. Thank you that I've had that opportunity. I'm grateful for that opportunity, okay? And how did I get involved in this case? Well, I'm a former prosecutor of domestic violence and child abuse. And by the way, pay attention to what's going on. Elizabeth Holmes claimed in her trial and in her appeal that she was controlled or abused by Sunny Balwani, right? That's why I got interested, because I was thinking, how are they going to get that in on a fraud case? They're going to say, domestic violence, right? So, and again, you can go ahead and take a look at the text, the revealing text video I did, the other text video I did on the text between Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes. And you can make, think for yourself and do your own analysis. You can make your own analysis on whether or not you think that was an abusive relationship, okay? Let's see. Pungai, she may just go all the way. She may just. Why not? Let's see what happens. JH, thank you. You're welcome, JH. Okay, so let's move on here. I want to get to, I got to look at my quick notes here. Okay, so regarding this, again, regarding whether or not this decision will have any impact on her pending appeal, where she's asking the Court of Appeal to reverse her conviction and in the alternative to be resentenced, this decision does not impact that, right? Because the Court of Appeal, that's a separate appeal. The Court of Appeal is going to be looking at what's called the record of the case. They're going to look at the trial transcript. It's going to be a written transcript of everything all the witnesses said. Dr. Rosendorf said, Erica Chung said, etc. They're going to look at all the motions. They're going to look at the entirety of everything that's happened. And because Elizabeth Holmes is asserting constitutional violations on appeal, the court's going to be doing what's called de novo. It's a de novo, meaning a new look at it. In other words, they don't have to necessarily look and follow or defer to what the trial court decided on some of the evidentiary rulings. For instance, one of the issues on appeal is that Elizabeth Holmes is claiming that she was denied due process because the SEC testimony that Balwani gave in a separate proceeding, where Balwani admitted that he had sole responsibility for the financials, that testimony, that information was not entered into evidence. It was not considered by the jury. And Holmes is claiming that had the jury known that Balwani incriminated himself and that Balwani took sole responsibility for the financials. In other words, Elizabeth Holmes had nothing to do with the financials, right? Which was one of the allegations, one of the alleged misrepresentations that Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani made, was that Theranos was financially sound and stable. Okay, so that information was not given to the jury on what Sonny Balwani said, sole responsibility. And the reason that's important, because on appeal, Holmes is claiming that if you look at, she was convicted on 3 investor counts and the jury was hung on 3 investor counts. Well, guess what? The 3 counts, this is according to the defense, all right? I take a neutral position here. I'm not advocating for either side. I'm just trying to explain this stuff. On the 3 counts where she was convicted, those 3 witnesses did testify they saw some of the financials. The 3 counts where the jury was undecided, those 3 investors did not. So the defense is arguing clearly that those financials determined whether or not the jury would convict, okay? And if Sonny Balwani was solely responsible, then the jury made a mistake. Then the court erred, the judge erred in the evidentiary ruling, keeping that testimony that SEC, Sonny takes sole responsibility. That evidence out of the trial. Okay, that was one of the reasons that she's filing her appeal. All right, let me look at your notes. How long do you estimate? How long? Thank you, Dano. Great question. How long do I estimate the appeal will take? Depends on what the Court of Appeals caseload is. When a defendant separate, okay, it's a separate appeal. When the defendant is asking to stay out of prison, when there's a pending surrender date, they tend to expedite those decisions. But when you're having the court look at volumes of transcripts, the opening brief filed by Elizabeth Holmes identifying the issues that she's complaining about or has issues with, that she has, whether the violation of the Constitution or whether the judge made an error or whether the judge applied the wrong standard of proof in sentencing, which is very interesting. Then the court looks at the prosecution's response to that appeal. So the prosecution will be filing their appeal, possibly this week or next week. Then Elizabeth Holmes has the right to file an appeal in response to the issues raised by the prosecution in their appeal. She's not going to be addressing new issues. It's just she's replying to what the prosecution has said. Then the Court of Appeal decides whether or not there'll be oral arguments. They're likely going to grant oral arguments. Then the Court of Appeal will make a written decision to either uphold the jury's verdict and the sentence, the 11 years and 3 months, or whether the Court of Appeal will overturn it, reverse the convictions and the sentence. We'll have to see. That process generally takes, depending on the Court of Appeals caseload, anywhere from 18 months to 2 years on average. Who knows? Okay. Who knows? We'll have to see, but I'm sure interesting things might happen between then. Now and then. Let's see. All right. From a legal perspective, yes, I'm a lawyer. Dana, there are several reasons why it might be convenient for the claim that Sunny Balwani. Yeah, well, it didn't work. I don't know if it worked or not in the trial. I mean, she's very lucky, in my opinion. I watched the trial. I was there, that she was not convicted on all 11 counts. One of the counts was tossed out because of late. They turned over one of the lab reports late accidentally. So I don't know, but she took the stand for 7 days. And the jury convicted her on only 4 counts. Okay. And when she was on the stand, I would have asked her, is that your real voice? That would have been maybe one of the questions I would have started with. I don't care if I would have been objected to. I would have asked it. All right. Shifting blame or responsibility. Yes, that is what she's doing. She's claiming that Balwani was responsible. And I think she recently said, I think there was some article, some writer wrote her opinions hanging out with Elizabeth Holmes, what she thought. I think in that Elizabeth Holmes said that she had made some mistakes. Well, that's a prime opportunity to ask her what were those mistakes. But that writer didn't ask her. I don't know why. Challenging credibility. Yep, that's what you do. Humanizing the defendant. Yep, that's what you do. Okay. You're welcome, Dano. Okay, Pungai, the defense is assuming the jury took those financials. Yes, they are assuming, but it's up to the Court of Appeal, and here's what the Court of Appeal has to look at. Did that evidence or those errors, whether evidence was kept out regarding Sunny Balwani's SEC testimony where he said he was solely responsible for the financials, or whether when Elizabeth Holmes wasn't allowed to do a cross-examination of Dr. Rosendorf's post-employment at other labs, one of which was investigated. It was very limited testimony that came in there. Holmes is claiming, hey, I have the right to ask about his other employment at other labs. That goes to his credibility, goes to his bias, which is the jury's opportunity to consider in coming to their verdict. In other words, being denied her opportunity to confront a witness against her. Okay, which is the Sixth Amendment. All right. So the court has to look at whether that materially impacted, the financials. Some of the witnesses not getting the financials. Some of the investors did see some of the financials. The Court of Appeals has to decide whether that materially affected the verdict. Okay, so that's going to be interesting. It's basically a call for the Court of Appeals to make. Okay, and by the way, I'm going to do a video. Hopefully I'll have time to do it. And I want to do it on the clues, some of the clues on how the Court of Appeal, and we're going to take a look back at some things I want to point out to you. I'll do a video on that, on the clues that maybe, point us to how we think the Court of Appeals is going to decide her appeal. Okay. And I'll just give you a quick, spoiler alert here. The trial court denied her motion for release pending appeal because there's not just one misrepresentation that Elizabeth Holmes was charged with. There were several misrepresentations, and I'll talk about that. All right. I'll talk about that in the next video. All right. The defense is all right. Let's see. Pungai, she was found innocent on patient. No, she wasn't found innocent. She was found not guilty. We don't have in the United States, there isn't a verdict of innocent. There's a verdict of not guilty, which means you have to meet the burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury did not find beyond a reasonable doubt that Elizabeth Holmes defrauded the patients or was guilty of those patient counts. They found her not guilty. That's different than innocent. There were other hung charges, which do not mean she's innocent. Right. And when the jury comes back undecided, it's called a hung jury. So on those 3 investor counts regarding Alan Eisman, I think the Hall Group, and I'll get to that in a minute. On those 3 investor counts where the jury came back undecided, that means they couldn't come to a unanimous verdict. In the United States, a criminal defendant is convicted unanimously. That means all 12 jurors have to agree to convict. They agreed to acquit her, to find her not guilty on the patient counts, but on the 3 investor counts, they came back not guilty. They came back hung. And if a jury comes back hung on a verdict, the prosecution has the opportunity to retry those counts. All right, we'll have to see. Life's a real dream. Realistically, if she begins service for 11 years and causes no trouble, how many years do you think she can knock off? Well, in the federal system, I think they serve around 80% of their sentence. So what is that, around 8 years, which coincidentally happens to be what my guess was on my very first video that I did on calculating Elizabeth Holmes' sentence. Okay. All right. So let's get to, let's see, the restitution. So get out your pens and pencils because I got a lot of math to go through here. So the judge ordered both Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes to pay $447,268 to the victims. Some of these victims did not testify in the trial, which is one of the reasons Elizabeth Holmes is claiming on appeal that her sentence should be thrown out, because she's claiming she didn't have the opportunity to cross-examine these victims, one of which is Keith Rupert Murdoch, otherwise known as Rupert Murdoch. I didn't know his first name was Keith. Rupert Murdoch, where the judge ordered her and Balwani to pay approximately $124 million to Rupert Murdoch. Okay, so let's get to the math here. So how did the court come up with the $452 million, and how is it different than what the indictment says? Okay, because the indictment counts, in particular, look at counts 3 through 8. Those are the investor counts. All right, and it indicates how much money Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani defrauded the investors of. Okay, and because she was convicted on the conspiracy count, along with Balwani, they're both responsible to pay that full amount. It's not split. It's jointly liable. Jointly liable means you're both on the hook for this. So if Sonny Balwani has no money, Elizabeth Holmes ends up paying it. Sonny Balwani has money, pays more of it. It's not split. They're both on the hook until that's paid off. Okay? Unless they win on appeal. All right? And get that restitution amount thrown out in the sentence, etc. And why the restitution amount matters is as far as determining the loss amount, because the more counts she was convicted on the investor counts, the more money she was looking at and being found guilty of defrauding the investors of. The higher that amount is, the more time she serves in prison. Okay? And because the judge considered a 27-month enhancement, that gave her an additional 2+ years because of the amount of victims. And the judge found 10 victims, not just the 3 victims she was convicted of. The judge also, in his restitution order, considered the 3 counts that Elizabeth Holmes, the jury came back hung on. So part of this restitution amount includes counts where the jury did not convict Elizabeth Holmes of. Okay? And this restitution amount also takes into account, it also includes investors who never testified at the trial, which she is claiming is a violation of their opportunity to cross-examine, to confront these witnesses, 6th Amendment, and her right of due process, which is the 4th Amendment, okay? No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, that means prison or freedom, or property without due process of law, okay? Which means basically you're given notice, right, that these people are going to be presenting this evidence, or the judge is going to consider this evidence. You have the right to cross-examine. I'm sure what the prosecution is going to argue in response is that the court can, according to the sentencing guidelines, I think it's in the sentencing guidelines. I have so much going on in my head. The court can also consider those counts that she wasn't convicted of, or other additional evidence. And so at sentencing, the court considered outside testimony in other hearings, affidavits, declarations from other investors, and use that to calculate the $452 million. All right, so let's get to it. Okay, ready? So count one, or I should say count six. I'm going to do it in this order, but anyway, counts 3 through 8 in the indictment. I'm going to go through that first, and then I'll do the investors who didn't testify at the trial. We'll get to that in a second. All right, so can I do this? Well, we're going to do it this way. Count 6 in the indictment was PFM Health Fund. Brian Grossman testified at the trial. In the indictment, it was $38 million that Elizabeth Holmes was charged with. But in the restitution order, the court found $52,639,000, etc. $52 million. The indictment said $38 million, but Elizabeth Holmes is ordered to be on the hook for the $52 million. Why is that different? Count 7 related to RDV Corporation, which is the DeVos family. Lisa Peterson testified at the trial. In the indictment, Elizabeth Holmes was charged with, and Sonny Balwani, charged with defrauding $999 million. So it's $99 million, almost $100 million. In the restitution order, the court just gave all of that is ordered to be paid back to RDV Corporation. Count 8 of the indictment relates to Dan Mosley. He testified at the trial. He testified to a loss of $5.99 million loss. The court in the restitution order granted all of that. Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani are on the hook for that. Now this is where it gets interesting. Alan Eisenman, he testified at the trial. Count 3. He was the one that sent that email to the prosecution basically saying, I'll do everything I can to help you, which I think backfired when he testified. But anyway, the jury found on that count 3, the jury came back hung. They were undecided. In other words, Elizabeth Holmes wasn't convicted on that count. But the judge ordered that she pay that. She and Balwani pay the $99,000 or so to Alan Eisenman. Count 4, which the jury also came back hung on, which relates to Black Diamond Ventures. Brian Tolbert testified at trial. The court in this current restitution order, even though the jury was hung, the court ordered that Elizabeth Holmes pay $5.3 million back to Black Diamond Ventures. Now, in the appeal, Elizabeth Holmes' appeal, she's claiming that there was no evidence to say that she caused these losses because there was no evidence at trial. There was no evidence in the declarations or the affidavits, etc., to show that she caused it. And they're also claiming that the judge, the trial judge, applied the wrong standard of proof. He applied the lower standard of proof, which is preponderance of evidence. So you just take the football past the 50-yard line. They're claiming, no, judge, it's a higher standard of evidence, higher standard of proof, which is clear and convincing. You got to take it past the 50-yard line. Okay, I'll get to that later in another video probably. All right, now let's go to count 5. Now count 3, 4, and 5, the jury was hung on. Here's another count where the jury was hung, but the judge ordered the restitution. In the indictment on count 5, to Hall Group, Brian Tolbert testified. In the indictment, it was $4.875 million, but what the judge ordered in the restitution was $1.875 million to the Hall Group. Interesting. All right, now let's get to the additional victims. These are all people who didn't testify in the trial. This is all based on evidence that was submitted at sentencing, whether it's declaration affidavits on the amount of loss that investors suffered, or it was called out extra record statements, which are testimony that was made in other proceedings, was allowed to come in for the judge to consider on how much restitution to order against Balwani and Holmes. All right, you ready? Sherry Eisenman. The judge ordered in this restitution that Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani has to pay her back $49,995. I assume Sherry Eisenman is probably Alan Eisenman's relative. Number 2, Richard Kovacic, and I apologize, I'm mispronouncing. The judge ordered in the restitution that $4.1 million, just over $4.1 million, be paid to Richard Kovacic. Well, he didn't testify in the trial. How about Lucas Venture Group? The judge ordered in this restitution $7.57, just over $7.5 million to the Lucas Venture Group. Again, Elizabeth Holmes is claiming she didn't have a right to cross-examine these people and to test the evidence to see how they came up with this, right? This calculation of their loss. And also she's claiming, where's the evidence to show that she caused this loss, right? One of the arguments could have been, or was, I think, that, hey, if Sonny Balwani is responsible for the financials, I didn't have anything to do with this. I made some mistakes. Okay, then there's the Mendenhall TF Partners. The Mendenhall TF Partners. In the restitution order, they were awarded $1.3 million. They're not mentioned in the indictment. They didn't testify at the trial. How about Peer Venture Group? They were awarded just over $93 million. Also, they didn't testify. Holmes didn't have the opportunity to cross-examine them. Again, I'm just pointing out what she's pointing out. I'm not saying I agree with it. The next one, Keith Rupert Murdoch, otherwise known as Rupert Murdoch. He was awarded $124,999,997, just under $125 million. And in the appeal, Elizabeth Holmes claims there was no statement by Rupert Murdoch that he suffered those losses. No, he didn't come in and testify at sentencing. He didn't submit any declaration. But yet the court ordered Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes to pay him back basically $125 million. Then the court in the restitution, this is the trial court, in the restitution order, also is ordered Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani to pay Walgreens back $40 million. And Safeway to pay back $14.5 million. So if you add all those numbers up, it comes out to $452,047,268 in restitution that both Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes are on the hook for. They're both responsible to pay it. They're not splitting it, okay? All right, any other questions there? Let's see. Okay, so that'll be interesting. That'll be interesting on the calculation. The restitution order, the judge awarded or is ordering Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes to pay for all the indicted counts, relating to the investors, all of them, whether or not the jury came back hung or convicted. You add all that up, it's approximately, I think, $165 million. And then the judge also considered the other investors under the umbrella of, or under the theory of, a judge can consider all the victims that were harmed, right? Whether or not the counts were charged or whether or not the defendant was convicted on, which I'm sure is what the prosecution is going to argue, that the court had the right to look at all of those additional victims, even though they didn't testify. They submitted declarations or affidavits, for the judge to consider. And based on all of that amount, I think if I did the math right, adding that additional, those people who, let's say, didn't testify at the trial, that's about $335 million, right? If I did my math right. So what's interesting is on the indictment, if you add up all of those investor counts, that's $165 million, but the restitution order is $452 million. I hope you guys are following me. So that's $287 million that was additional, beyond what the indictment said, $287 million, based on those 8 people or those 8 funds or people that I just went over, who suffered loss, who didn't testify at the trial. Okay. The jury didn't know about these people. Their verdict was based on who testified: Brian Tolbert, Brian Grossman, Lisa Peterson, Alan Eisenman. I got a pretty good memory here. Who else testified? Dan Mosley. Who am I missing? Oh, PFM fund. Those 6 counts, those 6 investor counts. They heard from witnesses relating to that, but they didn't hear from these, let's call them the 335 million additional loss. And again, the defense is arguing in Elizabeth Holmes' appeal that where's the evidence to show that she caused these individual investors loss? Where's the causation element? So it's kind of interesting. We'll have to see. All right, let me look at the chat here. Let's see. Pungai, I thought the judge have a lot of discretion. Yes, they do in terms of sentencing and restitution. Yes, they do. But they also are open to a second opinion. In other words, defendants have a right to appeal the sentencing, how the judge calculated. Okay? And if the judge made a mistake in calculating, applying the wrong standard of proof, which is what Elizabeth Holmes is claiming, relating to the causation element, applied a lower standard, then you can start to throw out those individual investor loss amounts. And if you're able to throw out the amount of loss, then she goes up the sentencing guidelines. I don't think she'll ever get to the 0.7 months that the defense has always wanted, but maybe she's able to knock off a few years, or maybe, that's resentencing, right? If the court allows resentencing, because the Court of Appeal can just stamp and say, yep, there's no problems here. Elizabeth Holmes had a fair trial. The errors were harmless if there were any errors in the trial, and they weren't prejudicial. Therefore, the Court of Appeal affirms, upholds the verdict, and upholds the sentence. Okay? All right. So the judge can basically exert justice by proxy. I don't know about that. All right, Pictor. Theranos took 900 million from the investors. Well, that's what's alleged. Okay? Or I shouldn't even say alleged, because the indictment, they didn't allege that. The prosecution brought that up in sentencing, because the prosecution has asked for over 800 million in restitution. But the court just ordered a restitution amount of 452, which is significantly different than the 800 million the prosecution wanted. Okay? And it's significantly different than what the defense has argued and is arguing in their appeal, because what the defense is arguing, Holmes' defense is arguing, is that the court, in their calculation of loss, didn't consider the value, the approximate $700 million in the value of the intellectual property, the value of her patents. They didn't offset or reduce the amount of restitution. The court didn't do that, and they should have, is what the defense is arguing. And had they done that, she would probably owe zero in restitution and zero amount of loss. Therefore, she would only be looking at 0 to 7 months in prison, right? Assuming there's zero loss amount. Again, go look at the very first video I did where I walk you through the sentencing guidelines, and you can look to see how the amount of loss, but the more you defraud somebody of money, the longer you're looking at prison, in time in prison, okay? They already to pay back half the investor's money. No, that's not right, Pictor. Look at the math I did. It's not half, all right? The judge has to make, the restitution order has to be based on actual evidence. You don't just flip a coin or split it in half, or, that's not how it works. That 900 million, by the way, was not entered into evidence at the trial either, okay? So it's just over 800 million. I think it's 880 million or so that the prosecution brought up in sentencing. Okay, that's what their number was for restitution. That's what they were asking for. But based on the numbers that I just gave you, for each one of these counts and each one of these additional investors, the judge did order and found a specific amount for each investor. So Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes well, I should say, so that when restitution is paid back, those amounts, those definite amounts, the 124,999,000, $1 short or so, less than $1 short, or $1,000 short, whatever it is, to Rupert Murdoch, because the court has to make a specific finding of what's the amount for each of these counts, each of these investors, what they lost, the RDV fund, the DeVos family, the Dan Mosley's family holdings, how much did they lose? That exact amount is what she was ordered and Sonny Balwani ordered to pay back. Michele, you're arguing no money was lost by Holmes. Good luck with that argument. I'm not arguing that. I've never argued that. I'm telling you what the defense is arguing, that if an offset was done, then from the amount of loss, then she would be looking at no loss, little or any loss. In other words, any amount defrauded. Pictor, you may be confusing that with what the defense has always been arguing, is that Elizabeth Holmes didn't sell one share of stock. She never profited. She never took any, never profited from this, right? In other words, she wasn't motivated by money to defraud, I think is what the defense is arguing. But the thing is you don't have to prove that you profit on a fraud case. Not to mention her lifestyle. Who paid for that? Okay. I know I'm sure they took salaries. I mean, go back and look at when I did videos on the accounting I think it's the accounting. Anyway, you can look at my playlist. It's probably in there. Okay. So any other questions? Any other questions? Anything else I want to say here? So, that's something the Court of Appeal has to consider. Is this restitution order in line with the evidence? Is there a violation of her constitutional rights to confront these witnesses that never testified at the trial? Or to cross-examine on these declarations, or cross-examine how they're calculated? Did the court make a mistake in not offsetting on we'll call it the residual value of Theranos? The alleged $700 million value of her patents or her intellectual property, her patents. Should the court have offset that? Did the trial court make a mistake in sentencing? Did it apply the wrong burden of proof? If it did, the Court of Appeal can toss it out. Okay, and she could be resentenced. We'll have to see. Remember, Jeffrey Schilling in the Enron case, he appealed his convictions. He appealed his sentence. The Court of Appeal threw out some of his convictions and they remanded it, sent it back to the trial court to have him resentenced. Okay, so it does happen. And what happened? At that point, the prosecution offered Jeff Schilling, former CEO of Enron, offered Jeff Schilling a agreement, that he served less time. I think he was looking at over 20 years, and I think the prosecution offered him 14, and he took it. Okay, so here's an example of a defendant who appealed, who won, right, on his appeal, came back, and instead of being resentenced, he got an offer from the prosecution, took a sentence, an offer that was substantially less than what he was initially sentenced to. Okay, so I hope you follow me on that. All right, Holmes wanted no prison. Yeah, well, Holmes and Balwani both wanted no prison. I think every defendant wants no prison. But when you misrepresent fraud, which she was convicted of, when you make a misrepresentation that someone relies upon, in this case, the investors relied that the technology worked, that the company was sound, that they were using their devices to do the blood testing, that they had an ongoing relationship with pharmaceutical or DOD, that the pharmaceutical companies validated the technology, that the media, she and Balwani gave statements to the media that were misrepresentations that generated those articles that were given to some of these investors. That was evidence that came in at trial. So that's why she was convicted, because those investors, according to the jury, on the conspiring to defraud investors and convicting her on the 3 counts relating to those investors, counts 6 through 8. The jury found her guilty of that. They heard the evidence, right? What statements did Elizabeth Holmes make to them? What information? Those investor reports, that investor call that I did. Look at the video I did on the investor call. Look at the prior videos I've done. Listen to what Elizabeth Holmes has said. Okay? It's not about her voice so much. It's about what she said. So when we make statements that are misrepresentations, some people may call lies, and people give you money or property based on those statements being true, turns out those statements are not true, you're looking at being charged with wire fraud, which is what Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes were convicted of. Okay? And they were convicted of conspiring together. That means Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes agreed to commit a crime, which was, according to this jury, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted of conspiring to defraud investors with Balwani. She was not convicted of conspiring to defraud patients with Balwani. Balwani was convicted on all counts. He was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 12 years, 12 years, 11 months. He's currently in prison awaiting the decision on his appeal, which is separate. Elizabeth Holmes is now headed to prison to await the decision on her appeal, challenging the convictions and sentencing. Okay? Anything else? Fungi says, I doubt she will even take an offer. The only offer she will consider is no prison or house arrest. Depends on how the appeal comes out. It depends on what happens between now and the appeal decision. Arguing financials will not get them off the hook. Well, that's what you say. We'll see what happens. I think that's an interesting argument. I think it's a valid argument to make. I don't know if it's going to have any traction, but it's certainly a valid argument to make. I mean, one of the things, and this is no disrespect to either side, but one of the things I would have done in the trial is pointed out when each one of these investors, Lisa Peterson, Brian Tolbert, Brian Grossman, took the stand, Dan Mosley, I would have drilled down on everything that they considered in making their decision to invest in Theranos to pull the focus away from statements that Elizabeth Holmes did make to them. Do you see what I'm saying? So if they're looking at what Roger Parloff put in his Fortune magazine articles, they were relying on that. They weren't relying on what Elizabeth Holmes saying. And then I would say in closing argument, I'd look at the jury and I would say, in order to convict Elizabeth Holmes of reasonable doubt, you have to consider, is there a doubt here? Is there a doubt on what they relied on? What statements they relied on? Did they rely on what Roger Parloff said in the Fortune magazine article? Did they rely on the investor call that Elizabeth Holmes made? Did they rely on the financials? Did they rely on the fake demos? Did they rely on all this other stuff, right? And look at the jury and say, it could have been that they relied on the Roger Parloff, the statements that he made, not that what Elizabeth Holmes said, statements he made, the articles that, or the Mad Money interview, statements that, other people made, or, what I'm saying here, looking at statements made by other people and look at the jury and say, is it reasonable to believe that they relied on those other statements or that they even considered those other statements? And if they did, that's reasonable doubt. So don't convict her on those counts. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there, not saying I'm right, but this is what we do in closing argument, not closing statement. Closing argument is when we argue the case, we argue our opinion of what we think the evidence has shown. We tell them what reasonable doubt is, moral certainty. Are you morally certain that these investors did not rely on the article written by Roger Parloff, did not rely on the statements made by, I think it was somebody from, I'm trying to think who the pharmaceutical person was, But you know what I'm saying? Shifting it away if you were defending this case, right? Because that's what the defense, that one jury instruction, reasonable doubt, are you morally certain that she is guilty of this? That's strong language, okay? And again, I've always said all along, are we to believe that Elizabeth Holmes, she drops out of Stanford, spent 4 days or nights putting together this patent application to come up with some kind of similar technology. And, spends from what, 2000 and I want to say 3, or was it 2000? I think it's 2009. I'm trying to remember what year it was, but she spent several years stealth trying to get the technology working on all the other assays, etc. She goes, rolls it out publicly around 2013, gets indicted in 2018. And, the defense is saying that her technology worked. It was basically human error, things that happened in the lab had nothing to do with her technology. But, in closing, maybe it could have been argued, or even in cross-examination of Elizabeth Holmes. And, how long did you spend putting this technology together? Drill down, ask her a ton of questions. You dropped out of Stanford, because of this. You wanted to be an innovative innovation in the healthcare industry. You spent nights putting together this patent application. You spent years putting this together, years and years, and pull all of that out of her in cross-examination. And then in closing argument, you argue, are we to believe that Elizabeth Holmes was hands-off? She developed this technology. Are we to believe she didn't know what was going on in the lab? When Sonny Balwani is texting her, it's a effing disaster zone. Okay, so enough of what I would have done. No disrespect to either the prosecution or the defense. All right, PCOR, 900 million is a ton of money, and the magic box did not perform. Well, according to Elizabeth Holmes, the magic box, it's not a problem with the technology. It's a problem with what happened in the lab. Okay, and you can look at the video I did on Tyler Schultz. Calls out Elizabeth Holmes. He sent her the email. He sent her the scatter plots showing that there was the variability in the results of the patient testing. I think Ms. Gangatar and I think Erica Chung quit because they were concerned about rolling this out with patients, doing, testing patients' blood tests. Okay, so anything else? We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens next. So any other questions? Anything else you guys want to ask me? Do hit that like button. Please do subscribe to this channel. So what's next is we should be getting the prosecution's brief responding to Elizabeth Holmes' appeal issues that she claims in her appeal. Then Elizabeth Holmes has an opportunity to file a reply brief. These briefs are filed with the U.S. Court of Appeal, Ninth Circuit. They're basically given a second opinion to make sure there were no errors, prejudicial errors, that Elizabeth Holmes got a fair trial and a just sentence, right? And is not wrongly convicted. Every defendant has a right to appeal their convictions and their sentence. This is what Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani are doing. So it looks like Elizabeth Holmes is headed to prison on May 30th. I don't know which prison. We'll probably find that out shortly. Let me see. Liz. Hi, Liz. I'm sorry, Lynn. Michele, obviously this is a huge amount to repay. We have no idea what Liz's finances look like. Well, I would say the court does, because that's part of the pre-sentence report, which is not public record. It's confidential. But the court has an idea of her finances. I know the media wants to portray all this, drama, but that's not what this video is about. Does the debt run in? Yes, the debt. She has to pay off the debt. Both of them have to pay it off until the debt is repaid. Okay, they have, it'll last until it's repaid. Schilling served 14 years. You got a sentence reduced 10 years. Yep. I doubt that you. Okay, let me see. Anything else in here? Pictor, it was not a public company. That's why she could. Pictor says it was not a public company. That's why she could misrepresent for years on end. Well, look around. There's been plenty of misrepresentations, right? There's a huge, in my opinion, there's a much bigger fraud going on, but I know the media wants to focus on Elizabeth Holmes. And personally, I think it's legally interesting. Okay, that's why I'm getting involved. I'm not following so much what the press is saying. They're trying to capture subscribers, etc. That's not what I mean, I would like subscribers, but I'm here trying to explain what's going on. You can call me the translator if you want. And I don't always get it right, but I'm trying to do my best along with doing everything else I'm doing. So, the thing is that's probably why there wasn't any audited financials. Had there been audited financials, so like, why did one of the arguments could be made, these people, some of these investors invested in Theranos because of all the hype in the media, right? They followed all the stuff. A lot of people make investment decisions based on, who's getting a lot of press, because you get a lot of press, more and more people get interested in that company and they may invest in the company. I'm sure there was a lot of people who made a lot of money off of Theranos, right? So, of course, the defense is saying that she didn't profit, but that's not what's required. Yeah, it was a private company. That's true. Yes, it was. But she had, a couple rounds of investors, C1 investors and C2 investors. She had a couple rounds. And according to Lisa Peterson and Dan Mosley, and who else testified, they wanted to select, Theranos was looking at selecting certain type of investor, right? If you look at the investors, a lot of them are venture capitalists, venture funds, right? And several of them are, wealthy families. Okay. So you can draw your own conclusions there. But they still, even though it's a private company, people still invested. Okay. All right. Anything else? So we'll see when she surrenders to prison. Looks like it's May 30th. We will see what the prosecution has to say in response to her appeal. And we'll see if oral arguments are going to be granted. I'm trying to think what else is going on. Anything else? Okay. So thank you again for joining me for this short notice, this live. Waiting for her to pull something. Yeah, well, you know what? I know a lot of people think that she's pulling things or she is doing things that other defendants wouldn't do. She's not, okay? I realize a lot of people don't have that perspective, but let me tell you, she's following the path of what many defendants do. And as a defense attorney, I would be pursuing all of this too. She has a right to test the evidence. She has a right to test the verdict. She has a right to see if her constitutional rights. She has a right to see if the sentence calculation was inaccurate. But again, appeals are very, very difficult for defendants to win. Most defendants lose their appeal. So I know everyone likes to get, the media likes to get caught up on her character here, her alleged character, but she's pursuing the path that a lot of defendants do. Okay. So anything else? Thank you, Pictor. Yes, thank you. I appreciate. Thank you for generous sharing of my knowledge. Thank you very much, Pictor. Yes. So let's keep this channel growing. Okay. Pass these videos, share these videos. It's quite an extensive live I did. I don't think you're going to see this anywhere except here. Although who knows who's going to, who else is going to do stuff. We'll see. I don't know because I don't watch anyone else. But it doesn't matter to me anyway. All right. So this information is there for you. I would like you to think for yourself, do your own analysis, check what I'm saying. Think about this stuff. You have gained, those of you who have been following me since day one, you have gained an incredible amount of legal knowledge, an incredible amount. I've talked about motions to dismiss, talked about the appeal procedure. I've talked about the motion for release. I've talked about a lot of these evidentiary rulings. I've talked about the evidence. I've shown you the actual evidence, the actual court orders, everything. So you have gained an immense amount of legal knowledge about the U.S. criminal system. Your analysis is nuts and bolts. The best. Yeah, well, I'm trying to break it down because, I'll save you the 3 years of going to law school and 30 plus years I've been as a lawyer. So, and I enjoy teaching and I enjoy sharing these videos with you. And I thank you so much. And I'm grateful for you subscribing. I'm grateful for your questions. I'm grateful for your support, and I thank you for your support. And if you want to contribute to me making these videos, PayPal link in the description box below the video. And please do share these videos. Please hit the like button and stay tuned. We'll see what happens next. Thanks again. Have a good week.